all those things, right? There's just, if you find those time pockets, there's a second life out there.
Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today, and in today's episode, we have Unstuck Economics featuring our first-time guest, I believe relatively new listener. For the first time ever, we're going to let somebody go by their real name. Please welcome to the show, Bo Jacob, CPA. Bo, thanks for coming to join us today.
Thanks, Cashflow King. Happy to be here.
So let's see, you emailed me a day or two ago, and for those that have listened to the show for a while, you probably heard me say that there's a lot of people that try to get on this show, and I normally say no. But for some reason, I was feeling like I said, you know what, the heck with it. We're trying to have more guests on this year, and you mentioned you had a book. I looked it up real quick. It looked really interesting, and I said, yeah, let's do it. And here we are a day or two later. So for the listeners, if you don't mind, kind of give us a little bit about, maybe your background and story, and then we'll talk a little bit about the book and how it applies to the listeners.
Yeah, thanks. My own personal background, CPA. I've been worked in accounting and auditing and financial reporting and various other things, which kind of creates that kind of professional income, right? But a few years back, I just started thinking about what are some of the other ways I can kind of branch out, or what are some other maybe hustles, for lack of a better word, just things I can kind of get my hands on to kind of diversify my income and just kind of pursue other kind of interests and hobbies and just kind of see what what can kind of create that additional income to kind of accelerate my financial freedom, essentially. So the book I wrote, Unstuck Economics: How Ordinary People Turn Smart Hustles into Real Wealth, you can get it on Amazon. Just kind of goes through my own journey. In the past, I've read a lot of books about how to become a millionaire tomorrow, or how to make it big. And I think what I kind of became frustrated at was either one, it was kind of very, very dreamy. It was like, hey, start a business today, automate it tomorrow, and then you can kind of retire by Wednesday of the same week. Or they have some very kind of unique, or kind of, I don't know, maybe they got lucky, or they kind of applied some very complex skill that maybe not your average Joe has, or they invested $500,000 into something and not everyone is sitting in that. And so a lot of these books just didn't seem like that approachable to me. And so I try to just lay out just some kind of, regular things that just your average Joe can kind of pursue and kind of start doing to kind of, create some additional incomes to, again, kind of accelerate that path to financial freedom.
Yeah, this is good. And this is actually very timely. I might actually jump this episode up the queue a little bit for a couple different reasons. Number one, I don't know if you listened to it or not, but we recently had an episode that got released with Equity Stacker where she was talking about lessons learned from the older worker. And one of the things that she was saying in there was, it was all about, you might have the main gig, or the professional job, or the W-2, or whatever you want to call it, but also about side hustles and side income streams and side businesses. And so I think, depending on where our conversation goes today, this actually could fit pretty nicely in with that, in terms of like, okay, but what if I'm not a photographer and I don't want to start a photography business? Or what if, fill in the blank, I don't have that particular skill set? What are some things that average, everyday people can look to do? And I'm sure we'll kind of get into that throughout our conversation here today. And I think this would gel really well, with that episode. And then the second reason, obviously, you had a book that came out. This book came out, like less than a week ago at the time of this recording, last Saturday I looked at, right? Yeah. So very timely in that regard as well. So, so I guess take us through a little bit about, if you want to talk more about your journey, that's fine. If you want to talk about, the kind of how the average person can do this, like, where did you start your side hustles while you were still working sort of the professional career, and what was that? What did that look like? What was that path?
Yeah. So I think a big, and I think anytime you do any book, I think it's hard to be like exhaustive, like, write out every single thing that you can pursue. And that's not really the intent of kind of what the book is trying to convey, even though there is, again, my specific journey. But I think, a couple of tools that were important of just kind of getting started, and I'll kind of get back to how that kind of fits in with, again, having kind of your regular job, is that something that's key is just like how we view our time. I think if you look at it, if you look at your average day, there's just so much time that we lose, whether that's to social media or Netflix, other things that kind of distract us. And I think, I'm not saying everyone kind of has this kind of privilege, but I do, work from home. And I talk about this in the book too, about like how it can be very difficult to kind of go into an office every day. Just, you tack on the commute, you tack on, the water cooler, chatter, you turn on, you add in, the long lunches that you might have, where like all those things are just taken out when you can be a remote employee. And, once you kind of start looking at your day, and I would say if you can, be a remote employee, all this time starts coming back to you. And so the question is like, am I going to apply that to a hustle, to a second income stream, and really capitalize on that time? And, that's where I've been able to be the last, several years, taking that extra time and applying it to things that's going to kind of generate kind of that passive income.
Gotcha. And if I read right in the bio, you have 3 kids, so time is at a premium in your house, I would imagine, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
One story that I shared in the book was just, there's times where, I need to take the youngest, watch over the youngest kid, for example. I have a meeting, work meeting on my calendar, and, maybe I'm also kind of itching to get out and exercise. I'll literally grab the stroller, put the kid in, put in my headphones, start the meeting, and then I'm running with the stroller. So essentially getting like 3 tasks, done at once, right? And so just that kind of refusing like, time on your calendar just kind of die, or like, oh great, now I got to sit here for an hour. Now granted, there's some meetings where you have to be very active and you have to be on camera and all those things, but so you have to take that with I don't know if word of caution is the right word, but anyways, just you kind of do what works for you, but just kind of trying to condense tasks and be more efficient. I'm not saying be overly obsessive like Ben Franklin. I think he literally kind of put each 30-minute window into different buckets of every day of his life, but just kind of be more cognizant of where time is going. And I think with that, I tend to also, again, hopefully not every minute of every day, but also just think of, your day in terms of opportunity cost. If time goes down the drain, 2 hours here or an hour on social media, and your hour based on kind of what you make, let's say your hourly kind of income is $50, let's say, it's like, okay, well, I just spent an hour on social media. I guess I just paid, Instagram $50. So I tend to think of it that way.
$50 to doom scroll, right?
Exactly, right? And so just kind of trying to be cognizant of that your time truly is valuable, and not just, one example is the opportunity cost I just mentioned, but the other example is just what can you do with that extra time? Can it create a brand new business for you? Can it launch, an online store for you? Or, let's say, some people go into like, social media and they try to, become an influencer. And it's like, all those things, right? There's just, if you find those time pockets, there's a second life out there, I believe, where you can start these things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would also say, and this is something I used to be, quite frankly, a lot better at than I am now. There's another book out there, you probably heard of it, maybe read it, and listeners the same, called The Miracle Morning by Hal Elrod. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have.
Yeah. So I was, I've read that a couple different times, and there was a time period where I was doing the Miracle Morning and getting up super early, because everyone's different in terms of your internal clock, I guess. But for me personally, in the morning, specifically the early morning, I'm usually at my best. And, if you have kids or a kid, sometimes if they're still sleeping, you can get a lot done. Like right now, our little one is taking her nap. And so it's a great time for me to be as productive as possible during that short window that I have. And for some people, it might be later in the evening. But one thing that I did, just kind of as a quick aside, and this may or may not help some of the listeners, but it was, and I need to get back into this, about getting up earlier and then going to bed earlier. Because the amount of time, I'm not really a big social media guy, but when I do watch a fair amount of YouTube on YouTube Premium, and usually that's on my phone. And when I do that, I notice it's typically in the evenings. And I've been going to bed gradually a little bit later and later. And realistically, I think I felt something coming on in my throat. We took NyQuil last night, and I was knocked out. And I got up, and I was refreshed, and I was ready to go. I already went to the gym today. So far it's been a pretty productive day. And I think part of that is attributable to the fact that I was able to kind of go back to my roots, if you will, and know when you're most productive, and then utilize that time and make sure that, okay, we're going to go ahead and get up earlier, even if that means we're going to bed earlier, because for me at least, the most unproductive hours, I know you kind of talked about they can creep in throughout the day, and I absolutely agree with that. But I also think for me personally, a lot of times that's in the evening as well. Would you say that's for a lot of people too, or no?
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm currently getting up at 6, and some listeners might be out there like, oh, I'm doing 4 a.m. Then that's awesome. I'm trying to push into 5, so I'm trying to get better and better also. And yeah, obviously because I'm in the exact same way as you. Like around lunchtime or after lunch, then like my brain starts shutting down. So it's like let me just get those 7 or 8 hours of really productive time in the morning. And then yeah, as far as the nighttime, I would say the same thing. And some people say like, oh well, how'd you squeeze in to kind of write a book? It's like yeah, I would grab 30 minutes or an hour in the evenings. Like what kind of like what you were saying. Either it's that or I'm yeah watching some videos or watching a show or whatever else. But it's like hey, I'd rather pour it into something that's that I'm passionate about or that's going to create that's going to create an additional income, right? So I'm totally with you there.
Yeah. So all this, it seems like there's a few bullet points here in the book overview that I'm looking at, and that I think covers a lot of like the time move, right? Reclaiming those lost hours. Where do you want to take the conversation from here? If the listeners are kind of tuning in and saying, "All right, guys, I get it. Be a remote employee if you can. Do your work remotely. Maximize your day. Structure your time." And now I have, let's say, the listener says, "Hey, I have that 30 minutes, hour, 2 hours, whatever the case might be." How should they be thinking about repositioning that time?
Yeah. So I kind of lay out one example I talk about. It's like, hey, and I kind of give, the running example, you kind of, or, combine different tasks and kind of that hour that you pick up. And that, hey, if you start with that 1 hour, that's 365 hours in a year, which, comes out to, I believe, what is it, like almost nine work weeks. And so just imagine, like, if you had 9 work weeks, what new thing or what new idea could you kind of come up with? But the broader theme that I kind of jump into is, and people have expressed this in different ways, is just understanding the difference between, I guess, active income, or I call it rented income, versus owned income. Some people might call it, I guess, passive income. They might call owned income. But rented income, I just view as, hey, in order to get paid for 1 hour, you have to put in 1 hour's worth of work, right? Like if you work in retail or you work in fast food, like I work at that store for an hour and I get paid, X amount of dollars.
Yeah.
And oftentimes like that's where we start. If you have 2 or 3 income streams, like, I'm not saying like give up that kind of steady cash flow, but at the end of the day, like you can never exponentially make more than what you get paid per hour. And so, when you look at your life, like what are the assets that are actually creating income kind of without your, like, I guess, active participation, or at least actively having to put in 1 hour to get 1 hour paid. And that's kind of how you start framing the conversation. And so if you look at your life, it's just like, yeah, I go to work, I get paid for each hour I work, but I have nothing else in my life that really generates owned income, whether that's through real estate, whether that's through stocks, or whether I have maybe not something that's completely automated, but I at least have maybe a store or something else that's at least generating, again, more income than what I would make on just an hourly basis of again, standing inside of a store or something else. And so that's kind of where it kind of kicks off. We're like, start thinking a little bit bigger about owned income. And a couple examples, I mean, that I share in the book, I had a friend who, last few years, there's just been a huge boom. It's probably slowed down a little bit, but there was a huge boom of just home remodeling. And she's like, hey, let me figure out how to do wallpapering. And so initially, and I don't think, I don't know how to wallpaper myself, but I'm sure it's not overly complex, right? If you have a good eye for design and kind of marketing, start getting some clients. But, at first, yeah, you're putting up the wallpaper by yourself. And again, it's kind of rented income. I put up this wallpaper, it took me 2 hours, I made, X amount of dollars. But eventually the business grows, right? It's like, okay, I can't meet this demand. Let me see who I can hire. And then it's not just me going out. It's, this other employee that I have. Maybe it's 2 or 3 employees. And so we're all working. And I don't know if we use the word skimming, but I'm setting the rate high enough where I can pay my employee and also keep a portion of what they're making. I had a cleaner at one point who beginning it was just her. She was passionate about, she just loved cleaning. She was great. But yeah, word of mouth gets around, her business grows, and it's like, okay, I literally can't, keep doing just rented income where I'm going to every house. Like I can't meet the demand. So what does she do? She hires more people, and again, she's able to keep a portion of what every single worker makes. And so those are just a couple of examples of just turning rented income into owned income.
Yeah, like you're owning the means of production essentially. You've started off as sort of the one man or one woman show, and then you gradually build that over time. Actually, that just made me think about, and he's been on the show before as well, the Rent Reverend. We're actually going to be going on a trip together here in a couple of weeks, and he works as a firefighter full time. That's his rented income, I guess. Yeah. But at the same time, he's also built a business on the side where he does a lot of remodels for people. But he now has several guys that are working for him, with him, however you want to say it. But it's the same concept, where, because he did it since, he was a youngster probably in high school, and continued to do kind of the one-man show. And then all of a sudden it was like, all right, well, I got a business here and I can't keep up with the demand, and I need to bring somebody on. And they have somebody that they know that could be good here. Let's bring that person on. And the next thing you know, you're a small business that's growing and growing. So yeah, I think that's something that makes sense.
Yeah, when you mentioned firefighters, I just had my dryer vent cleaned out a few weeks ago, and got talking to the guy, and he was a firefighter, and all the employees of this company, they're all firefighters, and including the founder, firefighter as well. Started this dryer or dryer vent cleaning company. So perfect example of just someone who started a business and hires his buddies, and kind of branched out from there.
Yeah, it might be different everywhere, but I believe a lot of them, it's like 24 hours on, 48 hours off. So you definitely have some time to put towards other things. And a lot of times if guys are handy, that can help as well. I'm not handy in the slightest, so that that's out for me. But anyway, yeah, I think so. A lot of people thinking about this and listening to this, if it's like, well, wait a minute, I don't have a business, I don't have a side hustle, I don't have something else that's producing income. Holy shit. 100% of my time is spent on this rented income. They might be kind of freaking out right now. What would you say to them?
Yeah. So another thing that I mentioned of just kind of the key is kind of just getting started, right? And I kind of had a journey myself where, to your point, it's like, hey, I'm having this rented income. Don't really feel like I have a ton left over. Now, if someone is working, literally, it's 16 hours a day, and rented income, and they're coming home and they're going to bed and start doing the same thing next day, like I don't know if I can speak to like every single scenario, but let's just say you have the 8 hours that you're working rented income, and you're still kind of living paycheck to paycheck, or just not feeling like you're able to have a lot left over. For me, it was like, okay, if I have those, let's say I'm sleeping 8 hours a day, I have those extra 8 hours, and the question is, what am I going to do with what am I going to do with those hours? And it started off very simple, right? Where I was driving to work, and when I was actually going into an office, I was driving about an hour each day back and forth, and I was like, man, like, is there some way that I can kind of monetize this? And it doesn't sound fancy, it doesn't sound luxurious, but I signed up for Uber. And they have these kind of Uber destination modes where I can say, hey, I'm heading to this address, only had me pick up people, going somewhat of a similar direction, right? And so if I was heading back, home for an hour, I'd pick up somebody, shortly after leaving work, drop them off close to where I lived, and, you pocket, whatever, $30-$40, right? Another one was I signed up for a Coach Up, which is, a way to teach, lessons in sports. And I ran in college, and so I was like, hey, I'll meet up with people if someone's willing to pay. And so living in New York City at the time, and met up at Central Park, ran with them for an hour, taught them some tricks and some stretches and whatever else, kind of working through a training plan. And hey, there's like $50-$60 in my account. And again, we're not talking about, those aren't huge sums, but I go back to the example of even the person who started the wallpapering business, that you might be hesitant to, again, if money's tight, you're not able to put a lot away, you might be hesitant to, take that $500 or that $1,000, let's say, to really get a business off the ground, because you're hesitant of just like we take it harder when we lose money than when we make money. It hurts more to lose than to win, right? And so, but with these like very small side hustles, I call them seed hustles, just kind of get that seed money. What it does is it feels like kind of free money in a way. Like, yeah, you had to work for it, but like, what did you trade in? Again, just watching, a show, right? You just, anyway, so you kind of scrape together the seed money, and it feels like, again, something that you can use or something else, something that doesn't have to go towards kind of your fixed expenses. And it felt a lot easier to kind of put that towards something. And so, if you're feeling like, hey, I don't even know where to get started, just start small. Like, what seed money, like what easy money can I kind of, whether it's 500, can I make just to get 500 or $1,000 started, to get the tools that I need, or to get, the simple marketing that I need to set up, or the web page. I don't think the investment has to be huge. And I think there are ways to, as long as you're just careful about how you use your hours, to make that seed money.
Interesting. Now, are you saying that once somebody does that and gets the seed money, then they continue on that same path with whatever it is that they were using to get it in the first place? Or are you saying that they can then potentially take that money and use it to start some new business? Like if I'm doing the Uber thing and I have a commute, to and from work, and I'm using that to build up a little bit of capital, then let's say they have $1,000 just from doing that. What are you saying is their next step potentially at that point?
Yeah, and so that's where it kind of comes back to, like, okay, I've kind of gathered this seed money. I don't want to keep working, generating rented income for forever. Like, what kind of owned income can I kind of try to kind of work towards? And I think an obvious one is real estate. And I realized the last few years, I've changed a lot from the years prior. But I think generally, the trend in real estate is that, hey, you can have 2 or 3% appreciation on just your property. If you lock into a fixed rate, your payments are still going to be fixed, but you are going to benefit from that appreciation over the years. You're going to benefit from just inflation kind of driving up rents. And so obviously the easiest way to get into real estate is, sign up for primary residence that you're going to live in, and, live in it for a couple of years. Maybe have some other people live with you and, kind of help you pay the rent. And because you claim it as a primary residence, the fact that that you're going to live in it, the down payment can be a lot smaller. My first property, I put down a 5% payment. On
Same. Conventional. 5% down conventional or no?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So 5% on a $320K property, and in 4, and again, there's gonna be cycles in real estate, but 4 years after that, the place had increased from 320 to 550 or 600, and the cool thing about that is that with real estate in general is that it's I call it leveraged income, right? Where you can I didn't have to put down the entire 320K to almost double it to 600. I could put down only 16. And so, like, when you look at the return on 16,000, and you're making, let's say, 2 or 300,000 on one property over, my time period was a little shorter, but some people could be, hey, I doubled the value of mine in 10 or 20 years. Is that you started with a very small amount, and the return on, starting with 16K, turning it into 2 or 300. I mean, the return on that is just, it's over like 1,000%. And I wish I would have bought crypto, Bitcoin, when it was at $1 and made the same return. But as compared to the stock market, it just pales in comparison, right, to kind of the return that you can make there. And there's going to be smaller moves too. I mean, I think you want to cover the basics, right, of just kind of maxing out your IRAs, your 401k, HSA. Those are things that should always happen. They should be maxing out, but there are smaller moves where, and this kind of comes back to, again, I don't cover everything in exhaustive detail, but just, again, thinking about what you're good at. Like, do you have a keen eye for, a certain niche product, or something that, you create from scratch, like a new product, or do you have a certain skill that, people pay for, whether it's, coding, website development. I use people myself, to get the book published, editors, book launchers, just kind of various skills that you look at in your life, that say, hey, if I could have seed money and actually start a business, create a web page, and just do marketing for myself, can I turn this into something more? And so, real estate, it does require, you might need to drive Uber for a while to save up for that, and I think it's still 100% worth it. But going back to the cleaning lady I had, the wallpapering example, other people sign up to just be professional editors of like college essays. So those like smaller things just require a smaller investment, and if you're willing to kind of gather up that seed capital, those are just things that can turn into legitimate income streams that hopefully eventually replace your kind of your main job.
Yeah, no, I like that. And I was just thinking as you were talking there about the real estate thing, anyone that's listened to the show for a while knows that I also invest in real estate. We do some single family turnkeys. We also do a fair number of syndications. We don't raise money or anything, just as a limited partner passive investor. But, in every single one of those single family properties, there's a loan in place. Does there have to be a loan? Yeah, probably not. I could probably kill off some mortgages if I really wanted to, but at the expense of potential future growth and being able to continue to acquire. And, there's a whole, I think it's called The Small and Mighty Real Estate Investor. I want to say it was Chad Carson's book maybe, where he makes an argument for having fewer properties and then paying them off and all that. We don't have time to get into all that today, but the point is to what you were saying, and to piggyback on that, you can start, as I did, with the rentals, with a fairly modest amount down, and we still own them to this day. And through the forces that you mentioned, like inflation and just property appreciation over time, and your fixed rate mortgage providing a fixed component of that principal and interest on that PITI payment if you're escrowing for taxes and insurance, like all that is just very, very powerful. I was logging into our property management portal, I think it was last night, and or sometime yesterday, and I mentioned something to my wife last night. We had one of our properties that needed a new water heater, and then they had to do a little bit of a repair on the flooring and stuff like that. And all in, it was just under $2,000. And it was like, oh, well, that's part of it. But when somebody hears that, if you don't own any real estate or any rentals, and you hear like, oh my goodness, there was a $2,000 repair or a $2,000 expense, it's kind of like, somebody's hair is on fire, so to speak. But once you put certain things in place and you have your systems and, it's well calculated, then stuff like that's going to happen, and you just kind of almost expect it to happen. And I guess one of my points in saying all that is that, as I mentioned before on the show today, I'm not handy in the slightest. If I had to self-manage and deal with tenants and repairs and all that myself, I would sell everything tomorrow. But, it's all professionally property management company that does it. It's all outsourced, and that's all accounted for in the numbers. So it is very, very possible for people to do that. But to your point, it's not necessarily something that you're going to be able to do overnight. Like you said, it could be driving a lot of Uber or Lyft or whatever to be able to do that. And maybe that's not the first step for somebody. Maybe that's more of an intermediate step for them, right? But it is possible.
Yeah. And maybe just add another perspective, and I think, I even laid out in the book, talking about real estate is everyone's going to kind of have their own approach, and, you kind of briefly touched on yours. I think for me personally, I kind of look at the opportunity cost of, let's say, fully outsourcing, a property. I think if you do like an Airbnb, the cost is probably a little bit higher if you kind of fully have someone else kind of run it. But if it's just like a regular property, a lot of times they charge maybe 6 or 7% of the monthly rent, and then if they're going to fill it, if there's turnover, they're going to charge maybe even like half a month or a full month's worth of rent. And so that kind of comes back to like the opportunity cost for me. It's like, okay, what's kind of the average amount of time that I spend on each property, and if it's literally, and this is actually true, maybe about average of an hour a month, if that, honestly, maybe something breaks down or something needs to be fixed every other month. And so if I make one phone call and send somebody over to fix it, it takes me an hour. And that saves me, I don't know, $200 in a management fee. It's worth it to me, right? And I've also feel like it's been pretty easy to automate, just kind of creating my listings on Zillow. So, when it's not active, or when I don't need to fill something, it's not activated. But when I need to fill something, I just go back to the same listing, activate it, don't have to change very much, and it's back up, and I, fill it in a few days. That's not, again, maybe that's not gonna be the case for everybody, but again, just another perspective that, you're not required to, outsource it fully and kind of pay that additional fee. Most of my properties, I actually, I'm currently in Texas, and most of my properties are actually in Utah. And so I'm actually not even physically present.
I was going to ask you that. Okay.
Yeah. But still, with the turnover, I usually have to, request that one person goes by and at least make sure that, family that I have there can just at least, make sure that the new person gets settled, and maybe just inspect when somebody moves out. But other than that, I never have to visit the properties, and just kind of run it all remotely. And so that's just, again, everyone has their own approach, and if they don't want to deal with the headache at all, then yeah, pay the management fee. But I do think generally that it can be fairly hands-off also, if that's the path you want to go, and kind of save that management fee.
Well, that's good. I mean, so we're both doing it, but we're doing it two different ways, and I guess It just goes to show to the listeners that you can make it work either way, whatever works for you. And a lot of this stuff is going to be, you're going to have to make it adaptive to your situation and, what your preferences are, and, kind of go from there. Cool.
Yeah. And I not, the real estate move is I go through nine moves in the book, whether that's real estate, getting into e-commerce, how to think about product, how to start marketing, how to kind of set it up, looking at freelance moves, getting these various platforms, and just kind of just trying to generate ideas for people to kind of get started, and even really going into social media as well. If that's, I think what's cool about that is that, people that have started in social media, they don't necessarily have these kind of obvious skills that, you can really apply kind of maybe in a professional environment or even really learn in college. But it's just cool to see that, like, yeah, they have these inherent talents that they've been able to apply and really, make, really market themselves and really make it a very reliable income stream. Sometimes, I even hear of spouses quitting their jobs to kind of help out with social media moves. So there's plenty of things we can cover. But the last thing I'll kind of say about real estate is that it's not about, for me personally, like, it's not that I'm pouring every single dollar that I have into real estate, for example. I kind of like a balanced kind of portfolio. And so, if I have, X percentage of my wealth sitting in the stock market, I don't want it to be 100%, right? And so, can I put 20% maybe in real estate? And again, if you get, I don't want to say call it lucky, because I do think, again, real estate is consistently appreciated, but as real estate appreciates, the real estate can become a bigger part of your kind of overall wealth in terms of a percentage. But, I feel comfortable with where I'm at. Like, hey, if I have, 6, 7, or 8 properties, yeah, there's a lot of money tied up in that, but I also have a very healthy chunk sitting in stock market. And, I'm at a point where I can say, hey, if I'm looking at, retiring completely, I can live off of the rent just from the rent of these properties. And not all of them are paid off yet, but eventually they will be. And again, that could be retirement, just that. But then the plus side is that, whoa, I got, this return that I'm having on the stock market and a few other hustles that I'm doing. But one last thing I'll kind of say about real estate is that something that I think we forget about with stocks is that, especially if you kind of sell and buy frequently, is that every time you sell, you get hit with a tax consequence. And you're probably in the same boat as me, where, like, with real estate, it's fairly straightforward to still have a actual cash in hand each month, but still declare a paper loss on paper for tax purposes. And so those losses, from your depreciation on your properties, the various expenses that other expenses, to fix or repair, and just other deductions, it's very favorable when it comes to owning real estate. And so, once my properties are completely paid off and I'm just getting cash, I can take those losses that I've been accumulating for years and I can offset that against cash that I'm now getting in hand. Whereas, with the stocks and if you have just a regular IRA, whenever you take that money out, you're going to be taxed on it. Whereas real estate, you can kind of create this, I guess, entity or this kind of, hustle where it's just giving you cash. You're able to offset loss with it, and you pay no taxes. I think the best, a very clear example that people are probably very familiar with is President Trump, right? Where now this is not a political conversation, but it's more just like, we saw his tax returns, and it's like, yeah, in 2017, 2018, he's paying zero taxes. Again, it just goes back to, like, there's been people lobbying the government for this favorable tax treatment, right? Where, and I didn't read those in detail, but I'm sure he just has all these deductions that he's taken off against his cash flow. It's like, yeah, hey, I owe $1,000 to the government. Here's your money, and I'm gonna, keep the rest for myself. So, anyways, that's just like one thing where kind of stock market is obviously a great wealth generating tool, but I do love real estate, again, for just the fact that, once all your properties are paid off, you've most likely stacked up these losses over several years. Again, paper losses that you can offset against any income. And so I look forward to that, when all the properties are paid off and I'm getting money in the bank, and Uncle Sam gets zero of that. So
let me elaborate or maybe kind of extend this out just a little bit, and especially for the sake of the listeners. And I also want to make sure I understand that what you're saying here. So, for example, we'll take myself. So I'm a W-2 at the moment, right? Pretty high income. And for me, based on our situation and working with our CPA and everything, we cannot. And I know there's ways to do this with real estate professional status and short-term rental loopholes and all that kind of stuff. But we are not real estate professionals. We don't do the short-term rental thing. We have the long-term rental. So we are accumulating these passive losses that you're describing essentially in what a lot of people refer to as like the PAL bucket, the passive activity loss bucket. So it's a loss on paper, even though the properties generate positive cash flow in your pocket, right? That's essentially what you're talking about, right?
Exactly.
So right now, all the properties are leveraged, and so because we can't use that to deduct against my active income because we're over the thresholds, right? There are some very nominal thresholds where there's a partial phase out. Maybe we'll skip that for today. But I think for the listeners, what Bo's talking about is as you're accumulating these suspended passive activity losses in this kind of PAL bucket, eventually when those properties are no longer leveraged, they don't have debt on them, they're completely paid off. And now I think what he's talking about is, hey, his cash flow just spikes significantly because he doesn't have a chunk of that rent income going to cover the principal and interest portion of what used to be his monthly mortgage payment. So now his cash flow spikes. He has more income coming in. He has more positive cash flow, but he can use those suspended passive activity losses in that PAL bucket that have been accumulating over the years and sort of unlock that or take the lid off the top of it, if you will, if we're kind of looking for like an analogy or a metaphor here, and let those essentially take care of the tax obligation on that additional income. And I'm sure there's some nuance and some technicalities, and I might not be 100% spot on there, but is that essentially what we're talking about here?
Yeah, 100%. Where if I'm generating a paper loss of, let's say, I don't know, 30K or 20K on your properties, after 20 years, you built up losses of, and again, you're still getting cash in hand over those years, but just again for tax purposes, that passive income, you're let's say after 10, 20 years, you stacked up maybe 300K worth of losses, and so if after 30 years, all the properties are completely paid off, if I then start making positive income of, let's say, 50K or 100K per year from these properties, at least the first 3, 4, 5 years, I'm hopefully paying zero taxes on that. And so it's just a great tool for postponing the need to pay taxes. And there's other things you can get into of just selling a property, using that kind of gain to put into another one and kind of avoiding tax that way. There's several ways to kind of get into when we probably don't have time to exhaust all of
that.
But that's essentially what I'm getting into. Where again, going back to certain other hustles or kind of income streams you might have, is that a lot of times the tax can be triggered much sooner than that, just because you don't have the same deductions and the ability to kind of stack losses over years.
And then I'm just going to do one final extension on that, though. Like, let's say for the listeners, like, well, that's great. So I have these suspended passive losses, and maybe it gets me a half a dozen years, but then what? Well, presumably you could continue to buy properties and or even investing in these real estate syndications as a limited partner passive investor. A lot of them, because of the code, again, we won't get into the excruciating detail, but a lot of them are front-loaded with these depreciation losses, which presumably could then also go to offset that passive income and that cash flow from those paid-off rentals. So there's a way to basically keep it almost rolling in perpetuity if somebody wanted to.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, the kind of beautiful example I gave was like, let's assume everything's paid off, and you just kind of want to enjoy that. Then, but sure, and then you don't have those losses. But examples you gave, and even getting a new property is like, okay, well, let me add something else to kind of again continue to offset my gains and keep that low, keep that taxes as low as possible.
Cool. All right, for everyone that's yelling at their phone about, all right, guys, you talked a lot about real estate today. What else you got? Where do we take them next?
Yeah, so I'll just add one more thing on just kind of the stock market in general and just kind of how those investments work. And I know you've kind of covered some of these things in your other episodes, but a couple of things that is key is, and a big thing is, and even just kind of thinking about these income streams in general, is that how do I kind of accelerate my financial freedom? What's kind of the number in my head that I need to kind of support myself, and if that's 10K a month or 20K. Then the goal is like, okay, well, how can I, create these streams in my life, whether that's your your retirement fund, your real estate, stock market, your online business. How can I create these kind of streams to cover that number that's in my mind? And I think once that number is covered, or you're getting enough, income from these, say, owned income streams, that hey, your active income, whether that's your W-2 job, whatever else you have, you could technically, quit, right? And so, and a big part is this, like, how can I accelerate that today? How can I put it away enough money into, owned income to accelerate that process? And, one example I talk about in the book is that when my wife, when we got married, she was working in New York City. She was just kind of started a new job, and she was making $45,000 a year. But again, going back to this thing of like accelerating income, the 401k contribution, I think back then was about 20K per year, and so we said, hey, let's again, going back to just maxing out those things, is that we said, hey, let's stash away half of your income. And so she put away 20K into her 401k, almost half of her salary, as she was starting off. Again, so just so we can, put that into, again, an owned income asset, the stock market. And one example I go into, like, let's say you contribute $20,000 annually for 10 years, and then you just stop contributing for the next 30. And you earn, let's say, about an average of 8% in the stock market. I feel like historically that's a pretty conservative return. You'd end up with about $2.9 million at the end of that time span. Whereas in contrast, if you contributed the same amount in total, right, but you spread it out over the entire 40-year period. So instead of contributing $20,000, upfront for the first 10 years, and then letting it just ride for the next 30, you contribute just $5 for the entire 40-year period. Instead of having 2.9 million at the end of that, you only have 1.3 million. And so I think they call it the FIRE movement, right? Like, again, it goes back to the same concept, but just kind of stacking up things very early. And so that was just a big thing for us. And that goes into, your IRAs. I think they just bumped it up to $7,500 per year. Definitely max that out. Max out your 401ks early in your career. HSA is another great one. You can put away, pre-tax money. And it also allows you to, again, invest your HSA money in the stock market. And so it just grows over time. I think the limit on that is about, I think if you're married, I think it's about 8,000 or 9,000 that you can contribute. So just maxing out those things and maxing out early, putting as much as you can into it, and just kind of setting yourself up for the future is huge.
Yeah, no, that's great. A lot of good stuff there. Yeah, the example you gave with the contributions and that timeline versus spreading it out. I mean, 1.3, I think you said, versus 2.9, less than half. So you want to try to front load it as much as possible. And I personally did that by accident in my 20s. But yeah, I mean, it ends up working out quite well, and it definitely takes the pressure off later in life. And for those listeners that might be listening that are a little bit further along or are a little bit later in life and say, well, shucks, I wish I did that, but I didn't. I can't go back and rewind the tape. That's okay. You just kind of start with where you are and do the best you can, So, yeah. Cool. Yeah. Exactly. So are you still, you mentioned like a work call earlier, are you still working and doing these other income streams? Are you kind of quote unquote fully retired from, your professional rented income stuff, or what's the deal?
I mean, the goal is, again, just to be completely, have the owned income and retire completely. If that's what someone chooses to do. I still have a W-2. I still see the benefit of maxing out the various things that we talked about. But getting close to that point where, hey, if I feel like I've kind of done everything I want, in my professional or W-2 career, whatever you want to call it, I feel like I'm getting pretty close to that point.
Job optional.
Yeah. But, in the meantime, and I stress this in the book, that, rented income or your W-2 income is not necessarily the enemy. You might get a point where like, oh, I have my first $1 million in the bank. I can retire now. It's not, if you still enjoy the work, like, keep doing it. And, let it kind of continue to kind of be your seed hustle for whatever you want to launch next, whether that's adding on an additional real estate, whether that's adding on, some kind of, consulting business, and, kind of starting the marketing and creating the webpage, launching, a product. I mean, you see people all the time, and I'm a CPA, and so I think the stereotype is that we're not overly creative, and so, we might feel kind of, it's like hard to like find, what's that kind of $1 million idea to kind of launch, but, you see people, and I talk about this in the book too, that, in the e-commerce move, that, there's people launching stuff all the time where it's like, yeah, that's like, I could have done that, right? I mean, you have somebody, launching, the Stanley Quencher tumbler, right? Like it's like a water bottle, and suddenly everybody wants it. It's a water bottle. It's probably the millionth water bottle that's been done, but with the right marketing and kind of the right design and kind of creating a niche, yeah, people want that water bottle, right? And it's just, it kind of explodes. And so kind of looking in your own life of like, what are kind of the inconveniences that I kind of see in my own life, or what do I see that's like, oh, I really wish this could be better, or this could be more simplified. And I think, living in the very kind of digital world and like app heavy world that we live in, I feel like that's kind of how so many people are thinking, like, how can I make this more automated? How can I make it more seamless? And another example, and again, you mentioned you have kids too, is that getting babies fed, especially on a place like an airplane, can be a huge challenge where you have this heated water, you have the bottle, you kind of mix it in, and they have the formula. I've had like episodes where it's like, I forget one of those, or I simply just can't find it. You try to mix it all up. Something simple I mentioned in the book is like there's this bottle called milk plus water bottle where it's like it's all in one. It's like you just twist the little thing on top, the formula falls into the water, you shake it up, and you're ready to go, right? So again, it's like these are not like it doesn't take like rocket science to come up with these things. It's just like looking at your own life, like either one, like what am I good at, what talent can I kind of capitalize on, or two, like like based on where I'm at in life, whether it's you're a parent or there's something maybe in your own profession that's making you frustrated, like what can I look around at to just think about how can I improve on an existing product, and hey, if you're lucky enough to think of something completely new, then great. But I go back to, I just don't think it takes like a genius to come up with these things. I think it's a lot of people, now maybe some people, they launched their first product, the first kind of online business, and they maybe just get lucky. But my feeling is that these people who make it big and really create an own income stream with a new product is that they've been hustling for a long time, and maybe they launched like 5 or 10 things that failed. And again, these ventures don't have to be super expensive. Again, maybe it was put $500 into kind of getting to this product, or creating a prototype, or $1,000 here. And so it might take a little bit kind of trial and error before you find the thing that really takes off. I don't think it requires a huge investment. Just having that mindset of looking around you of like what can be improved, what can looking at what you're good at, and what kind of product can really make people's lives better. And I think if you start looking around everywhere, you'll start seeing those opportunities.
Yeah, no, that's great. We're about to take our first international trip with a little one, and I need to look into that little water bottle thing you said. So that's cool. Yeah. All right. Well, we appreciate you coming on the Real Talk Personal Finance podcast. Where can people learn more about you and more about the book?
Yeah, I mean, for now, I will have it up on Audible in hopefully a few days here. If you prefer to listen, I used to be a avid reader, but once I started listening to Audible, it kind of gets you hooked a little bit. But so it'll be available on Audible. Again, the book is called Unstuck Economics: How Ordinary People Turn Smart Hustlers into Real Wealth. My name is Bo Jacob. Or if you're still reading Kindle or even the print version, you can go on Amazon and get yourself a copy. So, I some people might say, hey, if you're talking about kind of own income streams, is writing a book kind of the best use every time? But I think at the end of the day, it's just, hey, if there's one person out there who picks up the book and it sparks an idea of something that they can kind of run with, and it makes a difference in their life, then you know what? All the time that I kind of had to, reclaim, or, that I felt was kind of dripping or being stolen from my life, that I kind of had to reclaim to write the book, then I think that'll make it all worth it if it just has if it launches own income stream for one person and it kind of leads to their financial freedom.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely going to be picking up a copy of the book. I saw it on Amazon. I haven't bought it yet, but I will. And again, we appreciate you coming on. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to the Real Talk Personal Finance podcast. This episode was Unstuck Economics featuring Bo Jacob, CPA. We will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.